Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about how to write 5-part harmony. Now, lots of people get involved in writing harmony in 4 parts, but if you want to write a 5th part, well, that can become quite a challenge. So I'm going to suggest a first step. This isn't the end of the story at all, but I'm going to suggest a first step in how you might go about trying to tool up to write 5-part harmony. So what you can see on the screen here is, first of all, I've written just a 3-bar excerpt in 4-part harmony, and then I've presented exactly the same music in 5-part harmony. So let's start by listening to what this sounds like. Here's the 4-part harmony version. And here it comes in 5 parts. And hopefully you can already hear it's a much fuller sound in 5 parts than it is in 4 parts. So we're kind of conventionally wedded to this idea of soprano, alto, tenor, bass. But actually there's an awful lot of music that you might want to write in more than 4 parts, particularly if you're writing for a choir that's going to have more than 4 parts, where you're going to have one of the parts divided, like 2 soprano parts or something, particularly if you want to write for some kind of quintet formation of instruments. So, how do we go about doing that? Well, what I'm just trying to show here as a preliminary exercise in kind of breaking beyond the 4-part limits into the possibility of 5 parts is that actually one way of doing this is to begin by writing a short passage of 4-part harmony. So let's see what we're doing and see if we can work out what these chords are about. So just to analyze these chords for a moment, I'm starting in D major with chord 1, and then I've got a 5/7 chord followed by a chord 6, and then I've got a 2/7 in first inversion, and then I've got a 5, and a 7th just crops up in the alto part as a passing note, and then I finish on a chord 1. And I've purposely written that as quite a conventional set of harmonic progressions, so there's nothing kind of radical about that. When you look at what's going on downstairs, you'll see in the 5-part version, I'm doing exactly the same thing. Okay, so what am I doing then? I'm just padding out notes of the chords. When you start to pad out notes of the chords, you can get in a bit of a pickle with all sorts of things, like the parts can get crossed over and they can get a bit tangled up. Sometimes you might have to create a little bit more space by redistributing the layout of the chord. We have rules of engagement, if you like, about writing in 4 parts. Like we try to avoid writing consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves, known as parallels in some parts of the world. We try to avoid doubling thirds in a chord that are major thirds. All this kind of stuff, all these kind of conventional rules. Now I have to say, once you get to 5 parts, it's perfectly acceptable to be a little bit more flexible with those rules, because that's the case by necessity. That's not the same as saying, oh great, if I write in 5 parts, I can completely ignore the rules. Well, I think still hold by the rules as much as you can. But for example, if you end up doubling a major third in 5 parts, it's a less serious situation than it might be deemed to be when you double a major third in 4 parts. Actually, lots of composers double major thirds in 4 parts. So it's one of those kind of spurious rules at one level. But the argument is always, if you double a major third in a chord, that major third tends to dominate the chord. So if I write a D major chord like this, with a D and an F sharp and a D and an F sharp, then those F sharps, that double major third, starts to shout at you a little bit in the balance of the chord. So it would be better not to double it and maybe have an A in the tenor part. So I've got D, A, D, F sharp. It's a better spacing of the chord because now we haven't got that third shouting at us quite so much. On the other hand, if I go back to the original chord, so D, F sharp, D, F sharp, and then I put an A in it as well, either at the top or maybe in the middle of the chord, then that doubling of the major third becomes a less significant issue because we've got an extra note in the chord that's kind of balancing up and not allowing that major third to dominate in the same way as it does when it's doubled in 4 parts. So we can be a bit more flexible about that. Occasionally, you might even run into situations where you think, I've got some consecutives, some parallels, and there's really no way out of it. Well, if that happens, it happens. But it's not to say that it's the first port of call. I mean, try to avoid it if you possibly can. But you can see basically what I've done in this conversion to 5 parts is that if we're thinking this vocally, and we don't have to think this vocally, but even if you were writing for string quartet or wind quartet and then you want to upgrade to quintet, for example, well, you know, it's the same principle, isn't it? We still sometimes think in voices. So in the original, I've got what we call S-A-T-B, soprano, alto, tenor and bass, but it could be, you know, 2 violins, a viola and a cello if you were writing for a string quartet, for example. And in this version, I'm effectively creating a second soprano part. So do you see these treble clef notes are kind of SSA, and then I'm kind of leaving the tenor and bass parts down there. So one thing you've got to think about is stems, what to do with stems, because you'll notice that, of course, I'm now writing 3 different notes at a time on the same stave. So it's very neat when you've just got 2 notes on the same stave. The upper part stems go up, the lower part stems go down. But here with 3 parts, well, what do? Well, if they're basically both soprano parts, well, it kind of makes sense to treat the upper 2 parts as one factor and then have the lowest part in that treble clef as a separate issue. So by putting those stems up, you can see that I've got 2 soprano parts effectively, and then I've got a stem down for what would be the alto part. Now that's only a problem if you're writing in short score. In other words, putting all these 4 parts or 5 parts onto 2 staves. If you're writing for instruments, then everybody's probably going to have their own stave. So this isn't a problem with the stems, but it's just something to think about if you're having to write in short score. Now then, how am I converting these chords? Let's go through each example and think, well, what am I actually doing in order to create the 5th part? So let's look at the first chord. So what have we got here? We've got chord 1 in D major, and I've got it spaced D, D, A, F sharp. So I need to add another part in. So if I'm going to add it as a second soprano part, well, I need a note between these parts there. So what have I done here? I've taken that 4-part chord and I've put an extra note, a D, in there. It's really the only option if I'm going to create a second soprano part. Now, if I'm not worrying about second soprano parts, there's no reason, for example, why we could have not done that D, but we could have gone for an A there, couldn't we? That would have been another way of doing it, to put the A down in the bass clef. So if you were writing for instruments or something, you could be a bit more flexible with it. But this kind of makes reasonable sense, which also draws out another point. If you're starting with 4 parts and you're trying to create a second soprano part, for example, it's not a bad idea to make sure you've got reasonable distance in the 4-part version between those upper voices. You see, I've got space in which to work. And then every now and again, if you're too close together, well, what are you going to do? If I had, for example, chosen a D as the first alto note, well, there's nowhere for an additional part to go in between that D and the F sharp in the soprano part. So we need some space. So that's space is enabling me to put that D in there. Okay, what have we done in the next chord? Well, here's the next chord, and in the 4-part version, it's A in the bass, C sharp in the tenor, G in the alto, E in the soprano. So if I'm going to put a second soprano part in, what could I do? Well, I could put A in there. That A would be one way of doing it. Nothing wrong with that at all. So I could have gone for that A. There's a reason why I haven't done that, because if I'd gone for an A here as part of my fifth part, then A in this version downstairs is going to end up having to go to B, because there's nowhere else to go. We'll come to that in a minute. And then you'd have A to B in the bass, and that's creating octaves. So do you see why I haven't gone for the A? These are the things you have to think about. Because if you have an A and then you think, well, the only additional note I can put here is B, because that's the only thing that belongs to the next chord that sits between the D and the F sharp, above and below it, then I'm going to be cornered with this situation of octaves. So you've got to think ahead. So you might be looking at this thinking, well, I don't know why you didn't put an A there, because surely A would be better than this C sharp. What's the objection to C sharp? Well, C sharp means that we've doubled the major third. So this is one of these rules that we spoke about a moment ago. We're trying to avoid doubling major thirds if we can. If we double a major third in 5 parts, less of a hassle than if we do it in 4 parts. But in this case, the fact that I'm writing in 5 parts means that I've got to be even more careful than when I'm writing in 4 parts about creating these consecutives or parallels. So the choice is either to go for this C sharp or to go for A. That's the only choice that we've got as notes available to us of the 5/7 chord between the soprano and the alto notes. So on balance, I've realized A is going to give me octaves, so I've gone for C sharp, which means we have a double major third. Is it better to have a double major third than to have the octaves? Yes, it sure is. So you see how you have to make these kind of calls. Okay, what have I done in the next chord? Well, here we have a chord 6, a B minor chord in the original 4 part. From the bottom up, that's B, D, F sharp, D. And all I've done here is to add in a B. So there's a B that's added into that chord. Did I have any other option? Actually, no. Because if we're using chord 6 and I've got D at the top and I've got F sharp there, the only note that belongs to this chord in between those notes is B, which is why this B is not really up for negotiation, which is why if I had chosen A in the previous chord, I couldn't have just gone with that A and thought, oh, well, I'll change the B so I don't get octaves, because there's nothing you can do about this B. So that means if you had started with A here, you'd have to change the A to that C sharp to avoid the octave. So it also makes this point that happens in 4-part harmony, but particularly happens in 5-part harmony. Sometimes you might make a decision that seems perfectly reasonable for one chord, but when you write the next chord, you realize you're boxed in. Instead of changing the second chord of the two, you sometimes have to go back and do something with the first chord of the two. So it's always worth looking both ways on that one, isn't it? Now then, we come to the next chord. I've obviously purposely designed it this way to illustrate one or two of the issues. In the next chord, we've got a 2/7 in first inversion. Okay, I'm using 2/7B, that's the English way of putting it, but in the other system it would be a 2/7/6 chord. But this is this chord where we've got G in the bass, D in the tenor, B in the alto, E in the soprano. Okay, now if I'm looking for a note between those upper two notes, E in the soprano, B in the alto, the only note I'm going to come up with is D. Now, there's a slight sort of voice leading issue, because if I use D, that D wants to come down to C sharp. So voice leading is an important thing. Voice leading, basically, where does a note want to go? And you can hear, as soon as I play that D, you can hear it screaming to come down to C sharp. Now that's a problem, because if I have a D at this point that wants to go to a C sharp, that's going to create octaves with this tenor part. So I've got to think very carefully how I'm going to handle it. Now, can you see the solution I've come up with here? In order to kind of preserve these two soprano parts, what I've done is a slight re-engineering of things without changing the sound of it. I've kept the soprano and the alto notes, but I've used them as the upper two notes in this case. And what I've done is to insert an E in the alto part. So I've changed the alto note. It was previously on a B, now it's on an E, but the B is still there as the second soprano note. But in order to avoid getting octaves this time, you can see what I've done. I've put that E in the alto part and put the original soprano and alto part as the two soprano parts, because it's a solution that gets us out of a bit of a hole. Okay, and then what am I doing next? Well, partly because I've now re-engineered the alto part so it's on an E, I've decided to use an E again. And I've decided to restore what was in the soprano and the alto part. So this original chord in the 4-part version was chord 5, with a passing note in the alto part, a passing tone, you might know this as, that happens to turn the chord 5 into a chord 5/7. It's a very nice way of using one of those passing tones or passing notes, where you have a 5 and then you slip a 7th in passing. Now, what I've done in the re-engineered version is I'm thinking, well, I want to have that G, because otherwise, you know, we lose that opportunity to create the 7th. But again, we've got a voice leading issue, because if I have this G, it's going to want to resolve downwards by step, because a 5/7, the 7th always wants to pull down by step. So I've got to be a little bit careful what I do here, because if I kind of keep that in the second soprano, then it's going to have to come down to F sharp for the second soprano. So then how do I get the second soprano to be up there and still have an alto part? It's just going to box us in again, isn't it? So can you see what I've done here? This time in the 5-part version, I've kept the A and the E as minims or half notes for the two soprano parts, and I've put this G in the alto part, which means, of course, that when we come to the last chord, that F sharp is now in the alto part. So we get good voice leading from that G to the F sharp, the 7th falling by step. And by inserting an extra note here, I create a second soprano part between the original soprano and alto note. So the original chord was this chord 1, and now I've just re-spaced things. So I've got an A in the alto part, and I could have kept the tenor on an A, but I've moved it up to a D because it just consolidates that root for the final chord. But that's not a big deal. You could have stayed on the A if you wanted to. So hopefully you can see what I'm doing here by writing a passage of 4-part harmony that you might be quite happy doing, and then saying, well, here's my exercise to turn that into a passage of 5-part writing. And what I've tried to take you through is the kind of decision-making process that would enable you to bring that about. And having done an exercise like that, then it kind of frees you up to think about the issues of writing in 5 parts. So you might go straight to writing in 5 parts. There are lots of different ways in which you can write in 5 parts. You might not want to have block chords like I've got here. It's very kind of chorale-like at the moment. If you wanted to write an instrumental piece, well, you probably want those parts to be more independent. You probably want more counterpoint going in it. But the fundamental issues are just explored here as a background. I think the trouble that a lot of people have when they first venture into 5-part writing is that they try to write something quite adventurous in 5 parts without first thinking this way in chords. So I'm just recommending this as a method of starting to write in 5 parts by taking a passage of 4-part music, either one that you've written yourself, or find a passage of 4-part music, a hymn tune or a Bach chorale or something. Set yourself the challenge then of adding a 5th part in this sort of way to see if you can work out how to fix the various issues that I've just tried to highlight during this video. And then from there, you might want to do another exercise where you stick with the original 4 parts, but you try to write a free-flowing part for an instrument above it that's a bit more melodic, that's got more inessential notes, passing tones, neighbour tones, auxiliary notes, all those kind of things, so that you could have something that's a 5th part that's a little bit more independent, and that would just kind of tool you up to write in 5 parts. So it's a very useful skill, actually a pretty essential skill for most people who are writing stuff, because why do we want to write in 4 parts for the rest of our lives when you might want to score something for the whole orchestra and write in many parts? So moving into 5 parts in this way will just get you started in the right direction. Well, I hope you've found this video helpful. If you have, you might want to go to our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk, where you can click on the homepage, courses, for example, and you'll find lots of courses that we've got there that might really be useful to you as kind of follow-up to this. Lots of courses in harmony, aural work, aural dictation stuff, keyboard harmony, as well as other things besides. While you're on the homepage, have a click on Maestros, because that's another thing that might be of interest. We've got 3 levels of Maestros. Level 1 comes with some nice perks and it's a kind of support level. Level 2 comes with all those things with the addition of access to a monthly live stream in which I try to teach for an hour and give you something hopefully kind of quite meaty to go with. But there's a live chat running, so you can ask questions, we can contribute to the discussion. Or you can go for level 3, go for the full McCoy and have all the perks that we offer, including discounts on our courses, and you have access to 2 live streams a month, and in the second of those you can even submit your own work, your own compositions, harmony exercises, recorded performances, anything you like, and I'll actually evaluate them during the live stream. And again, we have very supportive live chat running through all of that, and it's a great chance to join our global musical community where you'll meet lots of like-minded people from all over the world. Anyway, it's all there on the website. Have a look and see what's helpful to you.